The Galactic Council chamber hummed with the low vibrations of 1,000 different species, each representative breathing different atmospheres through specialized suits and masks. At the center of the vast amphitheater, Ambassador Alex Kane stood at the human delegation podium. His simple black suit, a stark contrast to the elaborate, ceremonial armor and biomechanical enhancements worn by the other delegates. The humans had been granted membership in the Galactic Union only 3 cycles ago, and their presence still felt like an anomaly to most. They were young, technologically primitive by galactic standards, and their homeworld sat on the very edge of civilized space. Most species viewed them as barely more than clever animals useful for manual labor and simple tasks, but hardly worth serious consideration in matters of interstellar politics. The human delegation requests mining rights in the Outer Rim territories, Alex announced, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber's translation matrix. We offer fair compensation and adherence to all environmental protocols. A ripple of what could only be described as amusement passed through the assembled delegates. The hegemony controlled those territories, and they had never been known for their generosity toward lesser species. Crow, the hegemony's primary enforcer, rose from his position. Standing nearly 3 meters tall, his crystalline exoskeleton gleamed under the chamber's artificial suns. His species, the Vorthan, had dominated this sector of the galaxy for over 10,000 cycles. They were warriors, conquerors, and they viewed diplomacy as a formality before inevitable subjugation. The human speaks of compensation. Kral's voice boomed through his translator, each word dripping with contempt. What could your pathetic species possibly offer that would interest the hegemony? Alex straightened, meeting the alien's gaze without flinching. We offer innovation, Ambassador Kral. Human ingenuity has already silence. Kral's massive form moved with surprising speed, crossing the chamber floor in 3 powerful strides. Before the security protocols could activate, before any of the other delegates could react, the Vorthan's clawed hand wrapped around Alex's throat. The human's feet left the ground as Kral lifted him effortlessly, his crystalline fingers tightening around the fragile organic neck. The chamber fell into stunned silence. Physical violence during formal proceedings was unprecedented. The Galactic Union had maintained peaceful discourse for millennia. You dare speak of innovation? Kral's voice was barely controlled fury. Your species discovered fire while mine conquered star systems. You learned to forge metal while we bent the very fabric of space to our will. Alex's face reddened, his hands clawing at the alien's grip, but he didn't cry out. He didn't beg. His eyes, even as they began to bulge from the pressure, remained locked on Kral's. Every great journey starts with a few brave explorers. Sci-Fi stellar conflict is just beginning, and your support means everything. If you're hungry for HFY battles and tales of human valor against alien might, hit subscribe. It's free, and it helps us bring these frontlines to you. Your species exists at our sufferance, Kral continued, his grip tightening. You breathe because we allow it. You traverse space because we permit it. And you will learn your place in this galaxy, or you will be removed from it entirely. The other delegates watched in fascination and horror. Some had never seen a human under physical duress. They expected screaming, pleading, the immediate surrender that characterized most species when faced with Vorthan aggression. Instead, Alex did something that would be discussed in xenological circles for generations to come. Despite the crushing pressure on his windpipe, despite the obvious futility of his situation, he smiled. It wasn't a grimace of pain or a nervous tic. It was a genuine, almost predatory smile that seemed to say, "You have no idea what you've just started." Kral's grip loosened slightly, confusion flickering across his features. In his experience, lesser species either submitted or died. They didn't smile. Is something amusing to you, human? Kral demanded. Alex's voice came out as barely a whisper, but somehow it carried throughout the silent chamber. You're going to regret this. The simplicity of the statement, delivered without bravado or theatrical flourish, sent an unexpected chill through the watching delegates. There was something in the human's tone, a certainty, a promise that felt fundamentally different from the desperate threats they'd heard from other conquered species. Kral's response was to tighten his grip once more. But the damage was done. The humans' words had been broadcast to every corner of the galaxy, and Earth's response would soon follow. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened 18 hours after the incident. Ambassador Alex Kane lay in the medical bay, his throat bearing the distinct crystalline scarring that marked a Vorthan's grip. The human delegation had been expected to formally apologize and withdraw their territorial claim standard procedure after such a display of dominance. Instead, Earth's response had arrived in the form of a simple message transmitted to every major government, news, network, and military installation in the galaxy. The attack on Ambassador Kane is hereby considered an act of war against the human species and all our territories. The hegemony has 72 hours to deliver Krail for trial and make formal reparations. Failure to comply will result in immediate military action. The message was signed by someone calling themselves the Terran Defense Command, an organization that hadn't existed in any of the galaxy's intelligence files until that moment. Council leader Milos, an ancient being whose species had mediated galactic conflicts for 50,000 cycles, floated at the center of the chamber. His bioluminescent form pulsed with agitation as he addressed the assembled delegates. The humans have clearly suffered psychological trauma from the incident, Milos announced, his voice carrying the weight of millennia. We must approach this with understanding. Their response is typical of a primitive species that doesn't comprehend the reality of their situation. Krail stood in his designated area, apparently unconcerned by the human threats. Let them come, he declared. The hegemony controls 60 star systems and commands fleets that have conquered 100 worlds. What can one backwater planet possibly do to us? The question hung in the chamber's recycled air, but it wouldn't remain unanswered for long. 3 hours later, the first reports began arriving. Human ships' vessels that, according to galactic records, should have been simple exploration craft were appearing at the edges of hegemony space. The ships themselves looked unremarkable, boxy and utilitarian compared to the elegant curves of traditional galactic architecture. But there were so many of them. Impossible, breathed Ambassador Vex, the hegemony's chief military advisor. Our intelligence indicated humans possessed fewer than 50 interstellar vessels. The reports painted a different picture. Hundreds of human ships emerging from what appeared to be hidden bases scattered throughout the outer rim. These weren't the converted cargo haulers and mining vessels that Earth had registered with the Galactic Union. These were purpose-built warships, their hulls scarred with weapons testing and their crews moving with the precision of experienced military personnel. Meanwhile, in the medical bay, Alex Kane was defying every xenological prediction about human recovery rates. The Vorthan grip that should have crushed his windpipe had left him with a raspy voice and distinctive scars, but he was conscious, alert, and actively communicating with Earth Command. Dr. Nala, the station's chief medical officer, ran her scanner over the human's throat for the 5th time, her tentacles writhing with confusion. The damage should be extensive, she muttered in her native language before switching to Galactic Standard. Your trachea shows signs of complete collapse yet. You're breathing normally. Alex's smile hadn't left his face since the attack. Human anatomy is more resilient than most species realize, Doctor. We evolved on a world that tried to kill us every day for millions of years. We don't break easily. But the psychological trauma. What trauma? Alex interrupted gently. Krail did exactly what we hoped he would do. The statement sent a chill through the medical staff. They'd assumed the attack was an unpredictable act of violence, but the human's words suggested something far more calculated. As if summoned by the conversation, the chamber's communication system activated. A new message from Earth appeared on every screen throughout the station. Phase 1 complete. All human civilians are advised to evacuate hegemony space immediately. Phase 2 begins in 60 hours. The message was followed by technical specifications that made no sense to most of the reading delegates. Terms like kinetic bombardment platforms and quantum entanglement communication arrays appeared alongside star charts marking dozens of strategic locations throughout hegemony territory. Krail's confident posture began to waver as his own military advisors whispered urgent updates in his ear. The human fleet wasn't just numerous, it was positioned with a precision that suggested months, possibly years of preparation. They knew Krall said, his voice barely above a whisper. They knew exactly how we would respond. The Galactic Intelligence Network had been trying to understand the human response for 48 hours, and every new piece of information painted a more disturbing picture. The species that had been dismissed as primitive newcomers had apparently been conducting military preparations on a scale that defied their official status. Admiral Zeph, head of the Galactic Defense Force, stood before a holographic display showing the current tactical situation. His scaled skin had taken on the pale coloration that indicated extreme stress among his people. The human fleet movement suggests coordinated planning spanning at least 5 years, he reported to the emergency session. They've established supply depots, communication relays, and what appear to be mobile shipyards throughout territories we believed were uninhabited. The implications were staggering. While the humans had been presenting themselves as eager but naive newcomers to galactic civilization, they'd been systematically preparing for a war that nobody else had seen coming. But the most troubling aspect wasn't their preparation, it was their psychology. Dr. Keth, the galaxy's leading expert on species psychology, had been studying human behavior since their admission to the Union. Her latest report had arrived that morning, and its contents were being discussed in hushed tones throughout the chamber. Humans don't just fight, she explained to the assembled delegates. They wage war as a cultural expression. Their entire species has been shaped by continuous conflict, not just with other species, but with their own kind, their environment, and apparently the very concept of limitation itself. The delegates absorbed this information with growing unease. Most galactic species had evolved beyond internal warfare millennia ago, achieving planetary unity before developing interstellar travel. The humans had somehow managed to reach the stars while maintaining what could only be described as a warrior culture. Furthermore, Dr. Keth continued, human military doctrine appears to be based on the assumption that they will always be outnumbered and outgunned. They've developed tactical approaches that treat disadvantage as a starting point rather than a deterrent. As if to illustrate her point, the first human military action began exactly 72 hours after their ultimatum. The attack on Hegemony Station 7 was supposed to be impossible. The station orbited a heavily fortified world in the heart of Hegemony space, protected by defensive platforms that could destroy entire fleets. The humans had perhaps 50 ships in the area, facing defensive systems designed to repel invasion. Forces 100 times larger. Instead of attempting to overwhelm the defenses, the humans did something that no galactic military doctrine had ever considered. They ignored the defenses entirely. The human ships approached the station at what appeared to be a leisurely pace, broadcasting continuously on all frequencies. But they weren't transmitting threats or demands. They were broadcasting technical specifications, manufacturing processes, and detailed information about Hegemony military capabilities. They're giving away our secrets, Krall muttered, watching the tactical display with growing confusion. Why would they? The answer came in the form of a massive explosion that lit up the station's sensors. But the explosion hadn't come from the human ships, it had come from within the station itself. Internal detonation, reported the station's tactical officer. Multiple sections compromised. It appears to be sabotage. The humans had been broadcasting instructions to the station's own automated systems, using security vulnerabilities that hadn't been discovered by the Hegemony's own engineers. While everyone had been focused on the approaching fleet, the real attack had been taking place through the station's own communication networks. Throughout the galaxy, similar scenarios were playing out. Human forces weren't engaging in traditional space battles. They were turning the Hegemony's own infrastructure against itself, exploiting weaknesses that had been built into systems over thousands of years of unchallenged dominance. They're not fighting like soldiers, Admiral Zeph observed, his voice filled with something approaching awe. They're fighting like predators. The distinction was crucial. Galactic warfare had become ritualized over the millennia, following established patterns and conventions. The humans appeared to view these conventions as limitations to be exploited, rather than rules to be followed. Ambassador Alex Kane, now cleared for limited duty despite his injuries, addressed the council from his hospital bed. His voice was still rough from Krall's attack, but his words carried clearly through the chamber. "The galaxy has known peace for so long that you've forgotten what war actually means," he said. "You've turned conflict into a chess game with predetermined moves and acceptable losses. But humans never forgot that war is about survival, and survival means using every advantage you can find." His smile hadn't faded, and now the watching delegates were beginning to understand why. The Battle of Hegemony Prime was supposed to be humanity's Waterloo. The Hegemony had assembled the largest fleet in galactic history, over 3,000 vessels representing the combined military might of 60 star systems. They'd positioned this armada on their capital world, creating a defensive formation that could theoretically withstand any conceivable attack. The human response force consisted of exactly 237 ships. "They're outnumbered 13-1, Admiral Zeph reported to the Emergency Council session. "This will be a slaughter." But as the human fleet approached the massive defensive formation, something unprecedented happened. The Hegemony fleet began to experience cascading system failures. It started with the communication networks. Ships that had been coordinating perfectly suddenly found themselves unable to contact their command structure. Then the navigation systems began reporting false positions, causing vessels to nearly collide with their own allies. "It's impossible," breathed the Hegemony's chief technology officer, watching his screens fill with error messages. "Our systems are isolated, hardened against any form of external intrusion." The humans had spent 3 years studying galactic technology, not to copy it, but to understand its fundamental vulnerabilities. Every galactic species had developed their technology along similar lines, creating elegant, efficient systems that prioritized harmony and cooperation. Humans had developed their technology to survive in an environment where everything was actively trying to kill them. "They're not hacking our systems," the technology officer realized with growing horror. "They're speaking to them in their own language." The human approach to electronic warfare was unlike anything the galaxy had ever encountered. Instead of trying to break through security measures, they were convincing the Hegemony's own computers that the human ships were friendly vessels that needed assistance. The AI systems that controlled the massive fleet began offering helpful suggestions to the human commanders, providing real-time updates on ammunition levels, structural weak points, and optimal attack vectors. But the technological assault was only the beginning. As the human ships moved through the confused Hegemony formation, they began broadcasting something even more disturbing: psychological warfare. "People of the Hegemony," Alex Kane's voice carried across every communication channel, his words translated into hundreds of languages. "You're dying for leaders who see you as expendable. Your ships are failing because your commanders never taught you to think for yourselves." The broadcasts weren't just propaganda, they were tailored to each species' specific psychological profiles. The humans had been studying galactic psychology for years, identifying the cultural pressure points that could turn allies against each other. Kral, commanding the Hegemony flagship, watched his fleet dissolve into chaos. Ships were surrendering, defecting, or simply powering down their weapon systems. The carefully orchestrated formation was breaking apart as individual captains began making their own decisions about whether this war was worth dying for. "How is this possible?" Kral demanded. "We've maintained unity for 10,000 cycles." "Because you've never been tested," came Alex's voice from the communication system. "Unity without choice isn't unity, it's just fear. And fear breaks when people realize they have options." The human fleet had reached the inner defensive perimeter without firing a single shot. The Hegemony's own weapons were now targeting their former allies. Their communication systems were providing intelligence to the enemy, and their crews were abandoning their posts. But the most terrifying aspect of the human assault wasn't their technology or their psychology, it was their patience. "They've been planning this for years," Admiral Zeph whispered, watching the tactical display in fascination. "Every diplomatic meeting, every cultural exchange, every trade negotiation, they were studying us." The humans had turned their apparent weakness into their greatest strength. While the galaxy had dismissed them as primitive newcomers, they'd been conducting the most comprehensive intelligence operation in galactic history. "We underestimated them," Kral said, his voice filled with something approaching respect. "We saw their small fleet and assumed they were weak. We saw their simple technology and assumed they were primitive. We saw their eagerness to please and assumed they were submissive. What are they then? Asked his second command. Crow watched as the human fleet completed its impossible victory, achieving complete strategic dominance without destroying a single enemy vessel. There's something we've never encountered before. They're survivors. The realization was spreading throughout the galaxy. The humans hadn't just won a military victory, they demonstrated that everything the galaxy thought it knew about warfare, diplomacy, and civilization itself was fundamentally incomplete. The aftermath of the Battle of Hegemony Prime sent shockwaves through every corner of the galaxy. The hegemony, which had dominated interstellar politics for 10 millennia, had been defeated without the loss of a single human life. More disturbing still, they'd been defeated by a species that most galactic citizens had barely heard of 6 months earlier. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session for the 7th time in as many days. The massive chamber, designed to accommodate thousands of delegates, felt somehow smaller with the knowledge that a single human fleet could potentially neutralize any military force in the galaxy. Ambassador Alex Kane stood at the human delegation podium, his throat scarring visible even through the chamber's holographic display systems. The scars had become something of a galactic symbol, a reminder that the humans had turned a moment of intended humiliation into the catalyst for the most dramatic shift in galactic power in recorded history. The hegemony has agreed to our terms, Alex announced, his voice still carrying the rasp from Krall's attack. Krall will stand trial for assault against a diplomatic representative. The Outer Rim mining rights will be transferred to Joint Human Galactic Administration, and the hegemony will provide full reparations for the costs of this conflict. The terms were surprisingly moderate, considering the scale of the human victory. Most conquering species would have demanded tribute, territorial concessions, or outright subjugation. The humans seemed more interested in establishing principles than claiming spoils. However, Alex continued, this incident has revealed some fundamental misunderstandings about humanity's place in the galactic community. It appears that our species has been significantly underestimated. The understatement of the millennium, thought Council Leader Milos, his bioluminescent form pulsing with nervous energy. The Terran Defense Command has prepared a comprehensive briefing on human military capabilities, Alex said. We believe transparency will prevent future misunderstandings. The briefing that followed would be analyzed by military strategists for generations. The humans revealed that their primitive technology was actually a deliberate choice. They developed systems that were modular, adaptable, and designed to function in environments where everything else had failed. Their small fleet was actually a carefully distributed network of vessels that could be rapidly reconfigured for different mission types. Their simple diplomatic approach had been a comprehensive intelligence gathering operation that had mapped the psychological, technological, and political vulnerabilities of every major galactic power. Most shocking of all was the revelation that Earth's admission to the Galactic Union had been part of a century-long plan to integrate human civilization with galactic society, not as junior partners, but as equals. We never intended to remain in the shadows, Alex explained to the stunned delegates. But we needed to understand what we were dealing with. Humans have a saying, know your enemy. We spent 5 years discovering that we didn't have enemies. We had neighbors who'd simply forgotten how to recognize strength when they saw it. Dr. Keth, still processing the implications of human psychology, raised a tentative question. Ambassador Kane, if your species is capable of such comprehensive planning, why did you allow the attack to occur? You could have prevented the entire conflict. Alex's smile, the same expression that had unsettled Krall during the attack, widened slightly. Could we? Sometimes, Doctor, the best way to solve a problem is to let it solve itself. The galaxy needed to understand what humans are capable of when we're pushed. Now you know. The simple statement contained layers of meaning that the delegates would be unpacking for years. The humans hadn't just responded to aggression, they'd anticipated it, prepared for it, and used it as an opportunity to establish their position in galactic society. Krall, who had been conspicuously silent during the proceedings, finally spoke from his designated area. I withdraw my species' objection to human territorial claims, he said, his voice carrying none of its previous arrogance. "The hegemony apologizes for underestimating your capabilities." It was the first time in recorded history that a hegemony representative had apologized to another species. "Apology accepted," Alex replied graciously. "And Kral, when you stand trial, remember that humans believe in justice, not revenge. You attacked a diplomat, not a warrior. The punishment will fit the crime." As the session concluded, delegates from across the galaxy began approaching the human delegation with new requests, not for simple trade agreements or resource sharing, but for military partnerships, technological exchanges, and strategic alliances. The humans had achieved something unprecedented in galactic history. They'd gained respect not through conquest or subjugation, but by demonstrating that they were too dangerous to dismiss and too valuable to alienate. "What happens now?" asked Admiral Zeph, approaching Alex as the other delegates filed out of the chamber. Alex considered the question, his scarred throat catching the chamber's artificial light. "Now we get to work. The galaxy has been peaceful for so long that you've forgotten how to protect what you've built. But the universe is vast, and peace isn't permanent. When the next threat emerges, and it will, you'll want humans on your side." The promise hung in the recycled air of the chamber, and for the first time in millennia, the galaxy felt genuinely secure. Not because the threat of war had been eliminated, but because they'd finally found allies who understood that sometimes the best way to preserve peace is to be absolutely terrifying at war. The age of human integration had begun, and the galaxy would never be the same.